Hello there! Once again, I am a chess master from Iceland. My name is Ingvar, and I will be covering the Queen's Gambit episode 5. Now, we will mostly be covering, of course, as usual, the chess scenes. And the episode starts with Harry Beltic coming over. He calls her. A small inaccuracy there. She says Borgov used the closed Sicilian, and he immediately goes the Rosolimo, which is not something that people would identify with, although Rosolimo is kind of not an open Sicilian, so we can debate that. But nonetheless, he comes over to train, and unfortunately there were some errors in my opinion in these scenes. Starting off with this ridiculous position. Notice the pawn on h2, how did it get there? The double pawns on a6 and b5, the rook on e5 outside the chain, and the bishop on h7. This is not a position that would happen ever in a game between good players. He even mentioned before that it was her game against Benny, so this makes no sense. The sequence that they played also makes a little bit of sense, but not so much. The pawn is about the queen, but you can easily stop it with knight c6. And actually the main problem for black is the king on f8, which is in big trouble after h5. But this is a very strange position, and this scene didn't make a lot of sense. Then, a short while later, they're playing a game, and Beltic tips his king over, resigns. But if you look at the position, it's more or less the same position they were analyzing earlier. So again, it looks like they didn't have a chess consultant for this part of shooting or something. Either that, or he went out for coffee and they basically just used the same position. But okay, he gives her the Life and Games of Borgov chess book, and she starts to study his games. Then he offers Beltic to exchange rooks, but it seems like he didn't get the memo, and Beth starts to analyze Borgov again. Later we see some improvements in the chess scene, but unfortunately they mix the move order. We see Beltic play the queen to h3, but the queen is immediately unguarded on h3, the rook could have captured, and then he plays rook g1. The actual game sequence was rook g1 first, and then queen h3. Then they talk about he should have taken the pawn, and that might be in this position, where in the actual game Botanik Smyslov, c5 was played, and then queen g5, and the game actually ended here. The next chess scene, they're playing outside, and Beltic says, play pawn king 5 or pawn to e5, humor me, and that's indeed the Mykonos. But it looks like the position is wrongly set up on the board, because the pawn is already on a6 and the rook on a7, so it looks like somebody maybe pushed the board or something. They finally trade rooks, and then we see the next scene, which the position is a little strange here. The sequence kind of makes sense, although black didn't play the best moves, but it keeps me thinking that so many things resemble a famous game, Lasker Bauer, that I think they should have just used that one. Finally, Beltic leaves with some wise words about polymorphy, the pride and sorrow of chess. A great player, but maybe he partied too hard or something, and he saw the same things in Beth and didn't want her to go that way. So Beltic comes across as a good guy here. Finally, we go on to the US Championship 1967 in Ohio. And perhaps a bit of a shot at the US chess at the time, that the tournament was played in a cheap university hall, instead of the beautiful opera halls and theaters that the Russians were playing. But on to the first round. Before that, though, we have a mention of pushing wood, which Benny says to Beth, and that is referred to people that are called wood pushers. Wood pusher is somebody that just pushes the pieces, doesn't really know what he's doing. So the pieces are made out of wood, he's just pushing the pieces, doesn't really have a plan. So a wood pusher is not a good word to be described as a chess player. But then we get the first round underway. Manfredi, we see Beth move the d pawn, day one, and a nice scene there, by the way, sort of a montage. And the game that Beth played, I found in the database. It's actually a game between Kasparov and Alexei Drev, played in 2004, the Russian Championship. We see this very sharp line in the anti-Moscow Gambit. Huge sacrifices by black. He's getting some of the material back. He's down a piece for some pawns, but Kasparov with white, he managed to steer the game into an ending, and this ending we indeed saw here. But the actual game ended after knight d4. In the Queen's Gambit we see this, and Beth goes knight takes c6, but this is a horrible blunder because black can actually play the pawn to b3. White, yes, he played king b7, but the pawn to b3 can't be played, because if you take the pawn, then king b5 picks up the last pawn, so knight takes c6 would have actually spoiled the game to a draw, but he played king b7 instead, and knight takes a5. On we move to Benny's game, and we see sort of his position here in this very nice scene again, where they use the chessboard to give different pictures. And this game was actually almost exactly like the game between Dolmatov and Yusupov played in Armenia in 1981. Now they did change a little bit because black did in the Queen's Gambit play bishop g5 and trade on d2, but that's not how it happened. But we get this scene here with queen g5, threatening mate on g2, and the queen on d2 is undefended. So when you protect the mate with g3, there's knight takes h3 check, and then you pick up the queen, as Benny is doing here in the Queen's Gambit. I was also able to make out his next round game, and well, this was also from Armenia 1981, and this time it was Viktor Kubrechik with white here, and he managed to win a nice game by building up a nice protected pass d-pawn, and his opponent was Vitaly Tchaikovsky, 1981. And funnily enough, as we see the game come to an end, Beth's game was also based on a game by Tchaikovsky. But again, as all Beth's games in this montage, it was an actual Kasparov game. Kasparov had black here against Tchaikovsky. Tchaikovsky had sacrificed, and Kasparov found all the best defensive moves and repelled the attack. And eventually we're going to come to a position where the rook is being moved to d6, which we see here on the screenshot, rook moving to d6. So this is actually the game, and then we have resignation. Nice game. I found it funny though that Tchaikovsky was the opponent, even though the actual real games happened 23 years apart. Yeah, then we have some chilling, and she's reading Benny's book, Openings and Tactics. Quite amusing, which would probably not happen in real life right now. But then again, okay, the third round game of Benny, and there we're following a game between Kubrechik again with white and Yusupov with black, after Yusupov. And we come across this position here where Benny plays queen d7, just as Yusupov did, and then the black pieces move in quite swiftly here for the kill, and black wins rather easily in 21 moves. Beth's third round game was also based on a Kasparov game. We saw some glimpses of the ending in the Queen's Gambit of this game. This was the game between Kasparov and Svidler in 2004, like all the games. And Svidler resigned as his pawn on h5 is about to drop. We see Benny in the park. He meets up with Beth afterwards and says that they are meeting at the student union, having some beers and stuff. But we see her go back to the apartment. I didn't make out the position, but eventually she goes to the student union, and there they are analyzing a position. A typical Ruy Lopez position, and she suggests this move knight d5. I was able to find out that this was probably from the game Tal against Tukmakov, where Tal did play g4, and she said it only makes sense if the bishop moves in after g5. White does open up a little bit. The game ended in a draw, nothing special, but I think this was the game that they were talking about, and then they start playing some blitz. The first game that they play actually follows a game between Vasily Ivanchuk and Predrag Nikolic, actually my former teammate, and this was played in 1995, the PCA Intel Grand Prix. So this was an actual rapid game, and we see this nice move knight d3, which is tactically possible because at the end of it queen c1 will pick up the knight on a3 if white takes on d3. But then we see this nice maneuver here, and after queen c1, rook takes d4, Nikolic actually resigned, but in the Queen's Gambit, Beth plays on, she takes the rook, knight e2 moves the king, and then she doesn't seem to be surprised until after he takes the queen, which is very strange and would not happen with such a strong player. He would know this and probably resign after rook takes d4 or after knight e2. She pays up and they play another game. This time they follow a very sharp game played between Vladimir Kramnik, who defeated Kasparov for the crown, and Alexander Morishevich, and B takes c4 on our screenshot is right here, and from there, yeah, the game was very sharp. Kramnik got some very nice advanced pawns on the queen side, which were enough to win, and apparently they played out this game on the board, although we don't see many shots from the position. We saw the queen on f3, but not much else. The next game we see is the ending of a game between German grandmasters Paramitze and Graf. Looks a little random, nothing significant about that game, I think, and they just show the end of that game, and then, well, they run it again, and there's another game with the crowd building up. And yeah, this is the final blitz game we see, and notice this, he slides the rook to take the queen. This is not something advanced players do. They, well, we talked about it before, how you capture pieces, and then we see Benny just giving this mate. He took the queen and then played rook g8, checkmate. So actually the blitz scenes, well, had more substance than the actual game, because the game in the US Championship, they don't really show it. It's you and me tomorrow, and then he plays pawn to c4. We see that, but then we cut to the bar where they're talking about the game, and all they say is, well, I shouldn't have played that queen bishop pawn, the pawn to c4, and apparently she won the game, having been trashed in the blitz earlier. But again, that's not unusual. Some people are just much better in classical chess than in blitz, and it seems like perhaps Beth hadn't honed her blitz skills enough at this stage. So that was the end of the episode, but before I leave this review of the 5th episode, there were 2 quotes by Harry Beltic that I forgot to mention at the start of the video. First was when they were talking about chess players, and he said, "We're chess players, we're all prima donnas," and that in a sense is accurate, I must say. But then there was another quote that may or may not have meant something, and he said something, and she asked him, "Where did you get that from?" And he said, from Mrs. Greco, my 2nd grade teacher. And I thought this might have been intentional, because Giovanni Greco was actually one of the first chess players to publish something about chess way back in I think the 16th century or something. Italian chess player, so he's very famous in chess history. So yeah, this was my review of the 5th episode. A very good episode in my opinion. There were some errors at the start, but overall I like the vibe and the shots and the story. I just love this episode. This episode and the series in general. This one definitely took the most amount of work. I had a lot of positions that I had to look up and try to find. So many game references. I think I managed to do a good job, and I would really appreciate if you leave me a like and subscribe if you haven't. And well, on to the next one. Hope to see you when we review episode 6 and 7. Thanks for stopping by. Bye bye.